Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, and welcome to Jiangxie College, and welcome to Jiangxie College's HSI Speaker Series. In spring 2018, the college began a community dialogue on what it means to be a Hispanic serving institution. And it included in its effort this HSI Speaker Series to learn how we can develop policies and practices to help our Latinx students succeed. President Mason and I are committed to embracing and celebrating Jiangxie's HSI identity and to continuing to build a college culture that supports and serves all students and faculty in a culturally responsive and inclusive way. I'm honored today to introduce our first speaker, our very own Professor Jose Luis Morin. Professor Morin is the chair of our Latin American and Latino Studies Department. He came to Jiangxie in 1998. Everybody came to Jiangxie before I do. He's the author of several articles, chapters, and books. For example, Latino Rights and Justice in the United States, Perspectives and Approaches by Carolina Academic Press. He's the editor of Latinos and Criminal Justice, an encyclopedia published by Greenwood 2016. His area of specialization include domestic and international criminal justice, civil and international human rights, Latino and Latin American studies, indigenous rights. Professor Morin has received many awards, including 2005, 2016, the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, namely HACU, Kellogg Leadership Fellows Program. 2007 L Award for Outstanding Contribution to the Latino Community, presented by El Diario and La Prensa, the oldest Spanish language newspaper in the United States. Professor Morin has served in many administrative roles. He was the founding director of the Rosendo Fellows Program, founding vice president for academic affairs, and provost of Stella and Charles Gutman Community College. He was the interim dean of undergraduate study at Jiangxie and the interim director of CUNY-wide Latino Faculty Recruitment Initiative. Before coming to Jiangxie, Professor Morin was a civil rights and human rights litigator and advocate with organizations such as Center for Constitutional Rights, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. He has shown amazing dedication to our students, both in providing direct service through guidance and mentoring to advocating for change at the institution level. And also, I want to remind you, during the Hispanic Heritage Month, we also have many events that's in the poster as you have received. In his talk today, Professor Morin will introduce us to some of the wider and historical issues that should inform us our effort to become a more intentional HSI. The title of his talk today is Understanding Hispanic Serving Institutions, Background and the Context for Serving Latinx Students. Please help welcome Professor Morin.
Thank you, Provost. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, President, for being here as well. This is the first in this semester's series of HSI speakers, And what prompted this presentation was a presentation that I gave to a smaller group last semester, in the spring semester, a group that was very interested in delving deeper into the question of what is the H in HSI, what does that mean? And how does that differ from the L in Latino and Latinx? And I think that was those are very important questions. So one of the questions that comes up, and I think if there's a clicker, I don't have a way of, is there a clicker? Is there a clicker for the? Okay, all right. We'll do it the old-fashioned way. So bear with us. So yes, so the then question becomes, what do we know about people of Latin American descent, and how do we know it? And that's a fundamental question, may sound very simplistic, but one of the things that becomes very apparent is that we don't generally have much of an opportunity in the United States to learn about a population that is quite a significant population here in the United States for a variety of reasons. Last semester, in the spring semester, we had a presentation by Dr. Gina Garcia, and she talked about decolonizing the curriculum. And for some people, they sort of understood that in a metaphorical sense. But in reality, we are talking about trying to significantly decolonize what has been a curriculum that has pretty much excluded people of color in the United States. So the feedback that we had gotten, or that I received from the speaker series last spring, was that we needed more context. We needed more of a background of who it is that we're talking about, what it is that that was the impetus for the creation of this HSI designation at the federal level. And one of the ways in which this whole agenda was pushed was that with my department, Latin American and Latino Studies department, put together a position paper. And hopefully many of you have seen the position paper. There's those of you, or it sounds like I see heads nodding, yes. If you have not, you should definitely read this, because this will make a lot more sense to you when you get to read this. But the position paper, in essence, points out some of the disparities and issues that relate to John Jay College as a Hispanic serving institution, an institution that has been a Hispanic serving institution even before the term was actually even created at the federal level as part of legislation. So among the common questions we need to first understand, though, before we can start talking about that legislation in relationship to John Jay, is who are we talking about when we talk about or use the term Hispanic? Are they also Latinos? What's the difference between Latin American studies and Latino studies? I get that all the time. People are like, isn't that redundant? Isn't that the same thing? And so I want to delve into some of those questions. As part of the background, though, I do want to talk a little bit about where we are in terms of, right, this status. If under the federal law, the HSI status is accorded to an institution based on a certain percentage, 25% or more, where does John Jay stand right now? So if I can get the next slide. So if we look at the IPEDS, the latest IPEDS numbers, and you can go online to look at this, right now John Jay is 51%, according to IPEDS, Hispanic/Latino, 17% Black or African American, 16% white, 11% Asian, 3% non-resident alien, 2% two or more races. And this speaks to a significant population in our midst that are Latinx, and I'll use that term right now, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But we're talking about a significant number of students that represent this population group. What does that mean for the college? How do we look at how we're doing with respect to that group and all other groups? So if we look at graduation rates and racial and ethnic disparities, the IPEDS data is telling us that after 6 years, students are graduating at a 47%. The 4-year graduation rate here at John Jay is 24%. The national average for 6-year graduation is roughly around 60%. And when we look at the disparities between John Jay undergraduate student body and faculty and administrators, the contrast becomes quite stark and startling, right? If we're looking at a 51% Latinx student body, we have a faculty, John Jay faculty, that is only 9.8%. On the executive administrative level, we're looking at a 4.5%, that's Latinx. Again, compared to 51% of the student body that is Latinx. So the research shows that we should be concerned about this because student performance is enhanced when students see the faculty and administration reflected in the institution that they're being taught in. And it also speaks to how we can best become an institution that is Latinx serving and not just simply Latinx enrolling. So we will be talking a little bit about what that will mean. And the other point that I want to make is that overall, if we're looking at institutions that are Hispanic serving institutions or the larger category of minority serving institutions, one thing that the research is also showing and the data shows is that if you're serving that population, which is a significant part of your population, you're probably doing well by other students because other students in that institution are probably having very similar needs. And we know that to be the case because so many of Latinx students are first generation, just like many of the other students based on racial categories or ethnicity. Many of them are low income. So we have begun to make some inroads in trying to provide services and meet the needs of low income students. And those kinds of practices actually help the students overall, regardless of race and ethnicity. So if I look at what I'm trying to achieve with this presentation, which admittedly is a long presentation, I'm hoping that I can get through all of it. So I'm already going into the disclaimer. But in essence, I want to have you leave with a better understanding of what we mean by the H in Hispanic and the L in Latinx. And I want you to have a better appreciation of what that means in the context of US history and politics. And I also want to clarify some things about why this college-wide conversation about HSI status and designation is so important. Not just for that particular segment of the population, but for the future of this college. So I'll try to cover as much ground as possible in about an hour, leave some questions, some time for question and answers. But one of the other things that I want to just leave with you is that we want our students to be lifelong learners. And so one of the things that I want to just lay out as a challenge for all of us is that this is a process that will require that we also engage in the learning of who our students are, not just Latinx students, but all our students. That's what this dialogue is really about. It's not about how do we just serve one particular segment of our student body, but how do we look at this as an opportunity to engage in a conversation about all of our students and all of the student success that we want to have across the board, and how do we make that happen? So, in order for us to really start thinking about, well, who is it that we're talking about? Let's look at some questions, right? which of these statements, now I understand that we can't close the curtain, so it might be a little bit difficult. It might be a little bit of an eye exam sort of to look at some of these questions, but I'll read them out. So which of these statements about people of Latin American descent in the United States are true and which are false, right? Most are foreign born. Most are not US citizens. They don't want to learn English. They don't want to assimilate. They don't pay taxes. They take our jobs away. There are no real differences between the term Hispanic and Latino. Poor immigrants use public benefits at higher rates than poor native-born citizens. Only a very small percentage of the US population is not aware that Puerto Ricans are US citizens. And then there's some criminal justice questions, because this is a criminal justice school after all, right? Immigrants from Latin America are more prone to criminal behavior than US-born citizens. Based on annual FBI data across all categories of crime, the typical criminal in the United States is Latinx and African American. Longitudinal data show Latinx use illicit drugs at higher rates than whites. Whites are more likely to be victimized by Latinx or African Americans. So I want to give you a little time to think. These are more rhetorical. We're not going to have a whole dialogue on this, but I want you to think about the answers and which ones are false and which ones are true. And so if we go to the next slide, because I don't have time to enter into a dialogue, all of those are false, right? And so if you guessed all of them are false, you're right. But the question is, how many did you happen to get right because you guessed? And how many did you get right because you actually knew the answer to it, right? So that's a rhetorical question, right? Yeah, okay, but I want people to really think about these questions because these are really, questions that a lot of people would probably answer differently, right? I think we would agree on that. A lot of people do think that at least some of those answers are true. And if you're answering that some of those answers are true, that should be of concern, right? And the reason why I also pose that question to you is because it's a question that I pose to my students. I teach a course on the Latinx experience in criminal justice. And the first day of class, I will survey my students and ask just generally, anonymously, completely, are Latinos using illicit drugs at higher rates than whites? Are Latinx immigrants more likely to commit crimes than US-born citizens? And what is shocking to me, although I shouldn't be that shocked because I've already experienced this so many times, is when I find as many as there are who will say, yes, that's true. And that's concerning because it is a reflection of the absence of information that we have about a population that is so significant in our midst right now. And it also has implications for how do we expect a student who thinks so little of themselves and who they are to think that they can actually be successful in college? Do they actually think that they can succeed here or that they even belong here? And so it's also been my experience as a professor here that I've seen students tell me, I was ashamed of who I was until I took a course in your department. And that shouldn't be the case for any of our students. If they are admitted here, they should feel confident that they can succeed. And we should be doing what we can to make sure that this is the kind of institution where they feel that they can all succeed. So these are really important questions. And unfortunately, because the history books are so absent from having anything about Latinx populations, because that's one of the other questions that I ask my students. How many of you have ever taken a course in anything relating to the Latinx experience in the United States? Virtually none will raise their hand, right? How many have actually seen yourselves reflected in US history books? There I definitely get just practically no response. So what fills the gap, right? Is it what we see on television news, performances, theater, movies, right? If we think about, right, the list of movies, and you probably can't see this very well from all the way back there, but think about the movies from the earliest days of Hollywood films. There were things like Tony the Greaser, right, 1911, right? D.W. Griffith, in addition to making films, right, like Birth of a Nation, was also making greaser films, right? And Mexicans, Latinx populations were being depicted in very similar ways as African Americans, right? Criminals, people prone to want to pose a sexual threat to white women. But fast forward into the 20th century, right? Even till today, a lot of people's frame of reference to Puerto Ricans is West Side Story. Yeah. Right? How many of you grew up in New York City, and especially if you're a Puerto Rican background, you know, that was always a running joke, right? I see some people nodding, right? You know, oh, you're Puerto Rican. You must have a knife in your back pocket, right? And look at the popular films, even something like Scarface, which is now, there's a cult following on that film. And West Side Stories, there's another revival of West Side Story coming about, right? Some analysts have looked at that as very similar in impact to Birth of a Nation, but it's a Latinx version of that. Not to mention all the television shows, the news reporting, if we look at, right, how Latinx populations in the United States are reflected in the evening news. Overwhelmingly, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but in essence, overwhelmingly, the research shows time and again, Latinx and African American communities are overrepresented in the media in relationship to what actual crime is actually being committed by those populations. And crimes by whites are being underreported on the evening news and local television channels that we see. So if that's filling the gap of what we know about Latinx populations in the United States, the question becomes, what is it that we're doing about that situation? How are we, through our curriculum, through what we do here at the college, trying to, right, create a much deeper understanding of the reality of these populations, especially given that so many of our students come from that background. So this lack of familiarity with the history of Latin America and US and Latin America relations is very common. And one of the things that is central in understanding US-Latin American relations and understanding the experience of Latinx communities in the United States is the centrality of the concept of race. And the history of persons from Latin American origin, given this absence of information about race in relationship to Latinx communities, then creates another void of understanding. And what fills that void of understanding oftentimes, unfortunately, are stereotypes, misperceptions, ideas about color blindness, the black-white binary paradigm. And all of these types of ways of filling that gap in information then oftentimes reinforces the negative impact on communities of color, and it has a negative impact on our own students, whatever background they may be, right? That goes for all students. Because if there is a gap in our criminal justice curriculum about what is the experience of Latinx communities, all of our students suffer from that. It's not just simply Latinx students, although obviously they probably feel like they probably want to go under the table if their sense of what, right, is understood about crime in the United States is that their people are responsible for crime in the United States. That Mexico is somehow sending them over here to commit crime. And if that's the conditions under which they are studying here, or their beliefs are that, it's not only detrimental to those Latinx students, but it's detrimental to all students to have that understanding or that belief. So let's begin from the beginning, because we do need to talk about, well, what is this relationship between the United States and Latin America, and why is that so critically important? So I want to go through some slides that rather quickly, and hopefully you'll follow me, but I do really want to begin at the very beginning of the founding of the United States, because the United States was already eyeing Latin America as part of its property. They were looking at Latin America. Benjamin Franklin, 1767, right? And did the United States there declare its independence? 1776 and 1767. Benjamin Franklin was already talking about how Cuba and Mexico could be taken as part of the United States, right? Jefferson talked about having the hemisphere all to itself, that the United States would take the Spanish Empire piece by piece, right? And we oftentimes forget that the founding fathers, right, many of them were slave owners. They were looking at this from a racial lens, and that they saw Latin Americans as being other, right, made it justifiable to think this way, that they could just conquer these other lands, take them over, take their resources, exploit their populations, right? So by the late 1800s, right, Secretary of State Blaine, in a letter to President Benjamin Harrison, was talking about 3 places of real importance that the United States should take over, right? Hawaii, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Right? This was sort of the vision that the earliest, right, leaders, policymakers in the United States were thinking about in relationship to not just Latin America, but creating an empire that was going to compete with the empires of Europe. And the European countries were already, right, creating their own empires and their own colonial possessions. They carved out Africa, right? If we think about, right, the Europeans and how they carved, in fact, much of the lines of the different countries in Africa were not designated or defined by the people of Africa themselves, right? But by the Europeans who carved up Africa as colonial possessions. Or let's take Asia, for example, right? If we think about the British in India or the French in Vietnam. So if we look at the United States in relationship to Latin America, one thing that we do learn about or hear about, certainly in US history books, is this idea of manifest destiny. And oftentimes it's couched in very heroic terms, right? That this is about the US expanding its territory, spreading democracy, but we oftentimes forget that what really was underlying that was this idea that white Anglo-Saxons, Protestants in particular, were superior to all of those people in those territories, right, that were going westward in terms of the continent and southward, right? That there was a God-given right to take over these lands, to conquer, to subdue that population, because after all, those Native Americans were fierce savages. I'm using that term, fierce savages, because that's the language that's used in Johnson v. McIntosh, one of the earliest Supreme Court decisions around Native Americans and the rights of whites to take over those territories. So if we're looking at populations and defining those populations as racially other, as inferior, as savages, then of course their conquest is for their own good. And that happens to be true with the case of Mexico. By 1848, the United States instigates a war with Mexico, 1846 actually. By 1848, the United States wins the war and takes over half of Mexico, half of the country of Mexico. And with it is a population, significant population, that is there already, and that never leaves. Right? This is not a population that jumped the fence, right? The fence actually jumped them, right? They didn't cross the border crossed them. And they were subjected to some of the most degrading treatment conceivable. in spite of the fact that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, was supposed to convey rights of the populations, and this is a concept even under international law, even in those days, that if you were conquering another population, that you would, at the very least, accord that population equal rights under your laws. That was not the case with Mexicans. In fact, even the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was supposed to convey those rights, Article 9, for example, said that would only happen at a time, right, to be judged by Congress of the United States. It was not thought of that this would happen immediately. We're going to leave this to Congress to decide at some point. But we don't see these people as being people who could really be accorded adequate or equal rights. Article 10, by the way, of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and it's an interesting thing. You can go on to the State Department, their treaty section. Article 10 disappeared completely. So anyone know what Article 10 was about in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? There's at least one Mexican here, or somebody here that knows what that is. It's got to be. I'm going to out you. I'm going to out you. Article 10 was about land. It was the provision in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that was supposed to protect the land rights of the Mexicans there. And President Polk, who was an avid proponent of Manifest Destiny, was like, you can't possibly keep that in there, and forced its removal from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So if you go onto the treaty section of the State Department, it jumps from Article 9 to 11. They didn't even have the decency of renumbering it. It's like, this is just out of here. This is what this was really about. This is about grabbing your land. That's why we did this. Manifest destiny. It was our destiny, right? Our fate to conquer your lands. We're superior to you. And sure enough, that's how many people, including rich landowners, people who had a lot of property and land, they had to fight to keep their land. And when they lost in court, or even if they won in court against some of the white settlers, those white settlers would come back and they would force them off of that land, oftentimes. So when we look at what the United States perception of Latin America and much of the rest of the world that consisted of people of color, this was, and unfortunately we don't have a clear picture of this, but if you could just sort of, the caption here of this cartoon from 1899, a year after the United States takes over Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam, the Philippines from its war with Spain. Up front, you can see the caricature of, you can't see it probably from where you're sitting, but it's Hawaii, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. The disgruntled, ugly-looking, dark children in the front of the classroom. And Uncle Sam is at the head of the classroom. And behind the front row are the different children that have become part of the states of the United States. If you look at the door in this cartoon, outside of the door is a representation of an Asian. It's like this is a population that's not even educable, so why even let them into the inside? There's a Native American with looking at a book, but the book is upside down. And then the African American is washing the windows if you look at the left-hand corner. You might say to yourself, wow, this is really awful and racist. But this is what people really were seeing. Remember, there wasn't television or a lot of these other kinds of things that we have today. This is what people were seeing and believing, was the case. That here you have Uncle Sam really civilizing the world. And then the lesson in the blackboard in the back was something to the effect that, yeah, this idea of consent of the governed is a good idea, except when we're talking about these people. Right? And this really represented how the US government was viewing its expansionist, its imperialist adventures around the world. That it was going to compete with the big boys, with the big imperialist powers. And it was going to, under the guise of spreading democracy, take over different parts of the world. This was reflected in virtually every major newspaper in the United States. So this is the Cincinnati Post. Again, the very same racialized, negative, pretty disgusting representations of people from Cuba, Philippines, Puerto Rico, you name it. They're there in front of Uncle Sam, who's, again, at the head of the classroom. The person in the dunce hat, those are the Spaniards. So these racialized depictions of people from Latin America, from the Pacific for that matter, because the United States was looking at how does it expand its markets to Asia as well. So the Philippines and Hawaii, all of those territories became fundamental in the economic expansion of the United States. Again, another negative depiction. This is from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Again, the childlike, primitive, it's really hard to describe what they look like, but it's the same perception. Here is the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico depicted in these very negative, racialized fashion with Uncle Sam, right, being the person carrying the day for these people who can't govern themselves, after all. And then, of course, there's Puerto Rico, right? What would this, be similar to that we've seen lately, right? Perhaps the president throwing paper towels to a population. So these depictions are part of a long narrative of racializing and looking at Latin Americans as inferior. And if that's the case, then why will we ever accord them equal rights, right? So when it came to Puerto Rico in the 1900s, so what do we do with this population? Can we actually give these people who are of the Latin race and are of quick and excitable tempers, this is straight out of the US Senate report, right? How can we possibly give these people equal rights? And so sure enough, and I'll be giving a presentation on the legacy of Jim Crow in relationship to Puerto Rico as part of Latinx Heritage Month, so I'll be getting into much of this. But it was impossible for, Congress, and even more so, the US Supreme Court, to envision giving Puerto Ricans or Filipinos or Cubans or any of those people that were conquered in the war with Spain equal rights under the US Constitution, right? The Filipinos, again, this is the congressional record, right? According to Senator Bates of Tennessee, right? These weaklings of low stature with black skin, closely curling hair, flat noses, thick lips, large and clumsy feet. How can we possibly envision giving them equal rights under the US Constitution or under any law, right? So these cases that came out of the US Supreme Court called the insular cases. And with regard to Puerto Rico, one of the cases that is the key case that to this day shapes the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico is a case called Downs v. Bidwell, 1901. And in this case, the Supreme Court identifies all of the people that in these territories that the United States acquired in the war with Spain as alien races, right? Not ready for the blessings, quote, the blessings of a free government under the Constitution extended to them, right? And with regard to Puerto Rico and these possessions, these territorial possessions, they're not really a part of the United States. We very sort of nonchalantly talk about Puerto Rico as part of the United States. In a technical sense, it's really not. Go to the Supreme Court decisions. Puerto Rico belongs to the United States, but it's not a part of the United States. And the Supreme Court made that distinction because it wanted to make sure that there was no way that we could see people from Puerto Rico as being incorporated to the United States. Because that would mean we'd have to extend them all and complete rights under the US Constitution. So to this day, Puerto Rico's status, even under US law, is that of an unincorporated territory, that of which anyone who lives there cannot be afforded equal rights under the Constitution. And the consequences have been devastating, especially now that we, in light of what we saw after Maria, the Hurricane Maria, right? Puerto Ricans not only have no right to vote for the president of the United States, that can decide whether or not FEMA or any other federal agency will accord support for Puerto Rico, but all the laws that affect Puerto Rico in the most fundamental ways are not controlled by Puerto Ricans, right? The idea of Commonwealth is really, we can go into the congressional record, is really a facade. And again, we can you only need to look at the US Supreme Court decisions. As of 2016, 2 major cases went before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided Puerto Rico has no sovereignty unto itself. Under US law, it's the US Congress that has plenary powers, right? The power to really decide what happens to Puerto Rico is in the hands of Congress. And so whatever local decision-making goes on is inconsequential, right? Puerto Rico was in the midst of a hurricane that was devastating, and it couldn't get aid from other countries in Latin America, even the Dominican Republic or Cuba, or right next door. Why? Because US law prohibits, right, any goods to be shipped to Puerto Rico in ships that are not US made, run by US sailors, et cetera. So in the midst of this major crisis, Puerto Rico was only given a limited waiver, maybe a few weeks, in which it could receive aid from other countries. And it's all because of the Downs case. But let's look a little bit more broadly. If we look at US policy towards Latin America, from the Monroe Doctrine to the Roosevelt Corollary, right, to the Monroe Doctrine, which is more commonly known as the Big Stick Doctrine, or the Good Neighbor Policy, which really was not so good, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt used to talk about the support for the brutal dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua. And he was famously quoted as saying, well, he's an SOB, but at least he's our SOB. And when we look at the Cold War policy, some of the worst years in Central America for the people of Central America were those years in the 1980s when the United States was backing, right, brutal dictatorships, supporting oligarchs, like in El Salvador, 14 families, or the Guatemalan military that was installed in a US coup after they toppled a democratically elected government in 1954. If we look at the history of the United States in terms of interventions in Latin America, and this is just a small portion of the number of interventions, US military interventions directly into Latin America, under the guise of spreading democracy, no less, right? In none of these interventions and in none of these countries was one democracy a product of any of those interventions. Not one. In fact, oftentimes these interventions led to the installation of yet another brutal dictator. Right? If we look at what was being said in hindsight of some of that, this is really telling. Smedley Darlington Butler was one of the most decorated US Marines. And in the 1930s, he memorialized what he recalled were this decade of interventions that he actually participated in. And he says, I spent 33 years, most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1916. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National Citibank boys to collect revenue in. That's what's called Citibank today. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. So this is one of, right, the key military operators who were carrying out US policy. And what replaced that was the good neighbor policy, right? That was part of the big stick doctrine. So good neighbor policy is, how do we do this without having to send our military? How do we support a brutal dictatorship so we don't have to sacrifice our soldiers, just let them do it themselves? And that's where you get the Trujillos and the Somozas and the Stroessners, and the list goes on and on. So for Latin America, September 11th has a completely different connotation. For Latin America, September 11th is September 11, 1973, when the United States topples, right, a democratically elected government in Chile and installs the brutal dictatorship of General Pinochet. And the list goes on. And this is just a partial list of, right, the many coups and the many, right? Terrific, thank you. Technology. Now, how do I use it? That's the other question. So, and this history, analysts have seen the continuity of this history. So, for example, free trade. The United States has been very critical, at least the administration has been very critical of things like NAFTA. But 10 years after NAFTA, there were more poor people in Mexico, right, than there was before NAFTA, right? Real wages was actually down for most of the population in Mexico after NAFTA. Somebody was making a pretty penny on NAFTA, but it wasn't the common person in Mexico, right? If we look at the war on drugs and how Latin American countries pretty much had to buy into, right, a policy of extermination of these drugs and warfare, basically, in their own myths, a war on drugs that have pretty much been shown to be ineffective, because drugs today in the United States are as readily available and as cheap as ever, right? So it's a war that basically we've been losing for quite a long time. Yet the consequences have been felt of these wars because the wars were being fought in Latin American countries. And so finally, some Latin American countries are trying to rethink this whole policy around the US war on drugs that they've been pretty much fighting over so many years. If we look at, okay, I've gone and done it. All right, there we go, all right. If we look at the impact of, right, the 1980s, right, the tens of thousands of people that were killed, the tens of thousands who ended up having to leave their countries, the influx of many of the populations from Latin America really have their historical ties to, right, these historical moments. The 1980s and the wars in Central America were devastating on the population. So many of the students who we, right, see here as part of that Latinx population come out of these historical periods, right? Either their parents or they're coming here more recently out of the historical moments and tragedies that are existing in their own respective countries even now. So just to give you a sense of the proportion, right? The millions that died, the millions that were displaced, right? During the 1980s, if a similar catastrophe struck the United States in proportion, 2.5 million North Americans would die, 10 to 20 million would have been driven from their homes. If we were to look at it proportionally, how devastating it was for Central America, and what that would look like if people in the United States had experienced what people in Central America experienced in the 1980s. So what replaces that, right, are the violence that occurs right now, which is leading unaccompanied minors to come to the United States. So if we look at this trajectory, right, all of these things become possible because we also see, right, Latin Americans as being alien. We see them as unworthy of having real democracy, right? So the best that we can do is make sure that there's a dictatorship in place that's going to be conducive to US policy and US business interests, right? And we're also going to look at them as criminal, right? We don't want them to be coming here, right? Although we do want their labor. So we go through these backs and forths, right? Bracero program. We'll let them come in as, right, laborers. But we will expel them as soon as we see that we think that they are competing with white workers, right? Which is what happened in the 1930s. Or later in the 1950s, right? Which President Trump has vowed to bring back. He says he wants to bring back the policies of Eisenhower, a policy that was called Operation Wetback. So if that's the case, then how are people of Latin American descent going to be looked at, right, and treated? And we know that, right, even after slavery, segregation was the way that people of color were being treated, certain African Americans, right? And the system of segregation known as Jim Crow, right, basically replaced the institution of slavery. So this discrimination was still alive and well, right? But how much different was, right, the perception of, right, Latin Americans who are now in the United States than that of, right, African Americans. And so Latinx populations were also subjected to segregation. This is the Lone Star Restaurant Association, right? No dogs, Negroes, Mexicans, right? These kinds of signs were very common. Segregation in schools, in public accommodations, right? The idea that these are people who you cannot mingle with, all had this underlying undertow, that these were people who we can call greasers and call all sorts of other derogatory terms, right? Pachucos and wetbacks and spics and super predators. Today we call them illegals, right? Which is the equivalent of calling them criminals. And asylum seekers, right, are illegals, right? So, because we've sort of forgotten that there is, right, a convention of refugees that the United States has signed on, and that U.S. law is supposed to recognize the right to claim asylum and refugee status, right? And the word greaser, right, very much was the counterpart to the N-word, right? That it not only signified somebody who's dirty and shiftless, but it also meant that these are people who pose a sexual threat to white women, right? So when we hear the president, now the president of the United States, talk about, well, they come here as rapists, he didn't make that up. That's a long-standing narrative. And along with that narrative came the right to engage in vigilantism and lynchings. There's a long history of, right, lynchings of Mexicans, Latinos in the United States. And that is history that's also now being talked about and being rediscovered because it's a long and enduring history. This was actually a postcard. I mean, that's how celebrated these types of events were. They would send postcards of lynchings in the United States. Lynching of, right, Latinx women, and executions by, public executions by vigilantes. This is a depiction from 1863. So we see it in the law. California enacts what's called the Greaser Act. In 1855, it's an anti-vagrancy law. And if we fast forward to, right, the laws that are being implemented now, the racial profiling, that this actually made it really clear, and the term greaser was actually used in the Greaser Act in California, which pretty much allowed law enforcement to just pick up, right, whoever they considered, right, all persons commonly known as greasers. That was what was written into the law. From the Zoot Suit riots to the 1940s, and compare that to racial profiling today. Read the Floyd versus City of New York federal case from 2013, and how right, the judge in that case came to the conclusion, right, that African Americans and Latinos were basically being subjected to racial profiling. And the segregation of, right, Mexicans, Latinos in general, was pretty common, much of which happened post-1848. The Mendez case, Mendez versus Westminster School District, 1947 case, was actually a precursor to the Brown versus Board of Ed case. Thurgood Marshall was watching this case very closely because it's a case that a Mexican mother and her Mexican father brought to the courts to challenge the segregation of Mexican children. There was something that was called the Mexican Days. So this is the day that the pool, right before the pool was going to be cleaned so that white people can use the pool, the public pool. But the only day it was open for Mexicans when the pool was its dirtiest and was just about to be cleaned. Those were Mexican Days. And much of the Southwest and in California, this type of segregation was common. We're also talking about bathrooms. We're talking about, actually, one of the fascinating cases that went to the Supreme Court in 1954 was a case about the exclusion of Mexicans from juries in Texas. And when in the lower court in Texas, the Mexican-American attorneys who were arguing this case could not even use the bathroom in the courthouse itself. They had to leave the courthouse and use the bathrooms that were designated hombres aquí. This is a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Mind you, they were arguing in that same court that Mexicans were being discriminated against in access to being on juries. And they couldn't even use the same bathroom as whites in the same courthouse. So, and if we want to look at segregation, let's look at the New York public school system today, right? One of the most segregated school systems in the country. So the impact of past and present, right, inequalities and discrimination, unequal treatment, really has an impact on our lives today. This is not just ancient history. We're talking about a narrative that has filled the gap for a lot of people who never learned anything about Latinx populations other than what they saw in the movies, from West Side Story to what they're hearing now from people who represent the White House. That this is a population that is criminal. We need to be afraid of them. We need to build walls because these are people who are basically racially other. We're not talking about building a wall to keep out Europeans, white Europeans. This is a wall on the Mexican border. We have to be afraid of these Latin Americans. We can't trust them. And it's a long-standing narrative. So who are we to think that our students are not going to be affected by that? And what should we do about, right, the invisibility of Latinx populations in our own curriculum? So that opens the discussion about what are the best practices at an HSI. And so many of the best practices at HSIs and MSIs really have to be understood in the context of how they have the ripple effect, how they support and benefit all students at HSIs and MSIs, right? That these are practices that speak of enhancing diversity across the board at all levels. That these are practices that challenge ideas around colorblindness. Because if we think that we can just decide we're not going to pay attention to who our students are, we're just going to teach our classes the way it's always been taught, guess what the default is? The default is teaching our students in a traditional way, when we know that we don't have the traditional student coming to a place like John Jay. We also have to be careful of what seems to be an easy solution. Okay, we'll look at race from a black and white lens. And there's a lot that could be said about, right, this black-white binary paradigm. But in essence, what that paradigm does is really maintain white dominance. It accords certain benefits, perhaps to some African Americans, but it's really not about creating a completely diverse and culturally, right, competent campus. So we need to be looking at how do we become a culturally competent campus, not just for Latinx students, but for all our students, right? Because culturally competence means that we're looking at, right, what is it that will enhance the operations of the institution in ways that serve the population that is coming here, whether they're Latinx, whether they're African Americans, whether they're Muslims, whether they are LGBTQ, whether they're Asians, right? And the other thing that we should also think about is, what are these points of intersectionality, right? They're Latinx who are LGBTQ. They're Latinx who are Muslims. They're Latinx, right, who don't speak Spanish as their native language. They grew up in Guatemala. They speak a Mayan dialect. They come here. I've met them. So we can't be so quick to just assume, oh yeah, Latinx, they must speak Spanish. We've got to break through some of these assumptions to understand who we're really talking about, right? Africana Studies and my department have come together to begin a process of doing activities and some work around Afro-Latinx issues. And so the next, one of the presentations I'll be giving next is about, right, the legacy of Jim Crow in relationship to Puerto Rico. Because we need to understand those points of intersectionality, right? This is not the time for us to be thinking about, well, this is going to be at the expense or the exclusion of other groups. This is the time for us to think about John Jay as a community that needs to come together to be able to move forward with student success and become the institution that we want it to become. So understanding that, it's helpful to look at some of the ways in which, I don't know if did I miss? I'll get this by the end of the afternoon, I'm sure, I promise. So what are the things that really are components of cultural competency? Valuing diversity, which is a pretty obvious one. It's not easy to get there, right? Because it also requires us to do self-assessment, to understand what it is that we need to be doing to understand that we're making progress. So we have to be self-critical in this process, and I mean that in a constructive way. How do we assess what we're doing to make sure that we are making the kind of progress that we say we're doing or we think that we're making? The ability to manage the dynamics of difference, right? That's something that we will have to be intentional about, right? What are the ways in which we prepare ourselves to become more aware, to become more knowledgeable, to develop the skills to work in a multicultural environment, right? How do we, right, negotiate all of these different aspects of becoming a culturally competent institution? Institutionalizing cultural knowledge, institutionalizing the way that we work. So we're not reinventing the wheel all the time, that this is just a part of how we function here. So we have to think about, how do we institutionalize understanding our students? How do we institutionalize making our curriculum diverse? How do we institutionalize how we recruit faculty and administrators? What are the ways that we make the policies and adopt our ways to become, right, the kind of institution that is actually serving its students and not just simply enrolling them here? So incorporating HSI best teaching practices, and this slide is more about that, can involve so many different ways in which we can be engaging in that. I brought samples, for example, of different types of books, and I actually tried to put them in different categories so that you can see, right, the range, and this is just scratching the surface, but there is, right, there are the books and and scholarly works around Latinos in the law, literature, race, criminal justice, just about any discipline that we teach here. There's that literature, and there's a richness in that, because it's also about seeing the exciting ways in which, right, academia and scholars, Latinx scholars, have been engaging and filling a lot of the gaps that have been there for way too long. So it means that we should be thinking about how do we become much more knowledgeable ourselves of how do we integrate, right, Latinx themes into our curriculum. How do we think about pedagogy, not just throwing in a reading or two here and there in our syllabus, but how do we think about effective pedagogy that really speaks to meeting our students' needs, given what we know about our students, right? That we have such a large population that are immigrants, that are low income, that are first generation. How do we set the stage for critically thinking about what we do, and how do we engage our students in understanding the world around them and this diversity that's in our midst, right? And ultimately, how do we respond to the invisibility that is an issue, right? So with that, this last slide is some just self-serving advertisement for my book. But one of the things that I just want to leave with you is that in putting this work together, it was amazing for me to have learned as much as I did. I've worked as a civil rights and international human rights attorney for so many years, and even with that, right, I'm still learning about so much that I know that I should have gotten information about, but didn't. And so this is a process that we should all be engaging in. How do we learn more about the population that we serve, and how do we become the institution that we want to become in the future? By the way, I did provide some handouts. Thank you, Avi, so much for helping out with that. So I'm going to pass around these. I didn't want to pass them out earlier because it would have answered some of the questions that I was posing. I want you to think about the questions and not just look at the cheat sheet. Thank you so much. Let's have some questions if there's some time left for us to do so. Yes, please. Do we need a microphone?
I'm loud.
No, I think they need to
Oh, I didn't see it there. So I'm interested. I know you've got some of your students here, and I'm interested also in their perspective of what do you think we should be doing more of to support you in terms of creating a culturally competent college. And then the second question is that I've posed in different contexts, but I'm curious about how do we take these lectures that we have as a first step, but then how do we actually use them to change what we actually do and not just sit here and nod our heads today, but what are the real takeaways and how do we get to changing the institution to really benefit from this lecture series?
So let me attack the last part because I think that's really the most central right now. We just had Faculty Development Day not too long ago. There were several sessions around HSI status. They were very well attended. There was a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of interest in this issue and how to think about this. I think we need to go from thinking about this and learning about this to also starting to implement some strategies. Coming out with some really concrete ways in which people can be engaging with these issues. And it could be happening at different levels. So for example, the curriculum, not just simply, how do we put together a syllabus that has some more literature there, but is really much more intentional about delving a little bit deeper into some of these issues. Be it literature, be it history, be it just virtually every discipline that we can think of, in ways that are not superficial, because our students will also, sort of sense that, hey, you just threw this in there because you just wanted to, be the cool professor, that's multiculti, right? But I think if the student sees that you're really making an effort, right, to understand who they are and to have a conversation about, right, what is true to them, what is authentic about their place here at the college, I think that goes a long way. And the only way to really do that is for all of us to be engaging in ways that are much more intentional, that are much more planned out, that really speaks to concrete things that we could be doing. And I think probably one of the other things that we need to be thinking about is how do we do this from department to department? How do we do this in ways that speak to what each sector of the community is doing, whether we're talking about student affairs or academic affairs, or every unit in the college should be thinking about what is it that they are doing and what is their plan, right, to move this agenda forward. Not just simply, I attended that and that was really interesting, Jose. That was really cool. We like all of those cartoons. That was really awful. But the question is, how do we then take this knowledge and be able to implement strategies and timetables and really work on making some progress? How do we make progress and have this conversation among ourselves and give ourselves the space to ask what we might think are silly questions? The reality is they're not silly questions. If we're asking the questions, it's because people don't know them and they need to be asked. So we need to have the space to do that. And one of the ways to begin to do that is to have that conversation in each of our units, respective units here at the college, and come up with those kind of concrete plans. We need to be engaging our students much more. I mean, it's nice to see as many faculty and administrators here who are here. We need to see more students. We have, 15,000 students? And, it's great that the moot court is a big room. This is scratching the surface. This is really scratching the surface. How do we scale this up? That's what we need to be thinking about. How do we get this conversation scaled up so that we're all talking about this in our respective ways? I can keep going, Carol. And I'm sure there are plenty of ideas that you can come up with. Think about what it is that you think you need, right? How can that conversation take place in your department? How can that take place in your unit of the college? How can we be doing better outreach to our students? How can we engage the clubs, right? How can we engage college council? Is there anyone here from student council, for example?
And then it was just, I walked in and I was just like, whoa, everybody here is faculty, which is amazing because it just means that you guys care that much. But it only means that we need to promote more to the student body. And perhaps that's our fault in student council because we didn't promote it as much. But yes, I just love seeing so much faculty. It would be better to have like a bigger room so that students can come and participate. Yeah.
So I'll take you up on this. I'd be happy to present to student council and whatever configuration of students that you can put together. I'd be happy to do this presentation all over again because it's really important for us to have a common understanding. If we need to have this dialogue, right? There are too many people, for example, that are still confused about what's the real term that we should be using. Is it Hispanic? Is it Latinx? Is it Latino, Latina, right? And that's not a trivial question. It's a real question. And a lot of people asking it or want to ask it, and maybe they're not, coming forward, but it really makes a difference. Because if we look at this history, right, when we look at the term Hispanic, how did that sort of formally become, right, the official term? And a lot of that was the US government without really consulting Latinx populations in the United States, right? And it's more inclusive of that history of Spanish colonialism and in relationship to Spain and whiteness, right? That seems to be respected in the use, that use of that term. right? But when we're talking about building a wall, we're not talking about building a wall because we want to keep out Spaniards from Europe, right? We're talking about those people that are right south of the border who we have racialized as others, right? Who we consider racially different, right? And so the struggle, just like African Americans have struggled around terms like black and African American and et cetera, right? We've been struggling with those. What's a term that really represents, right, more accurately represents, right, the cultural makeup and background of the people from Latin American countries, right? Which includes, indigenous populations, African ancestry, right, as well as European ancestry. So the term Latino, Latina, right, became much more popular as a way of trying to, right, and adding the A, not just the O, was a way of being more inclusive in terms of gender, and now the X, because, right, we want to be more gender neutral because we want to take into consider LGBTQ populations. So it's an evolving term that we've been struggling with, and none of these terms are perfect, but it's better that we have a population that is actually defining itself and engaging in self-definition and a right of self-determination than having it imposed by some sort of government agency that's decided unilaterally, this is the term that we're going to use for you. And we will value only that which, right, relates to European ancestry.
Would you join me in thanking Professor Jose Luis Morin?
Thank you.
So, as we said at the beginning, this is the beginning for this semester of not just a conversation, but how do we really use this information? So I asked that leading question because I want to give you time to think about it, not a whole lot of time, because it's something, we don't want this just to be more talk. We need real action, real movement, real change, and there's been a lot happening, and we're meeting and talking about that. But I think that if you use these lectures as an opportunity to again begin going back, as Jose Luis said, to your departments, by departments I mean your units, not just those who are in academic departments, to really engage in the conversation about, okay, how are we going to better serve our students with having this information? What does it mean? And it's going to give us a head start because, news alert, we are going to come up with a new strategic plan that will start that planning process next spring. And news alert, the top two things we're going to be talking about are student success and what does it mean to be an Hispanic serving institution. We're going to have a limited five-year strategic plan with limited goals that we're really going to execute on. And so this gives us time to get ahead of that by thinking about, talking about, and really begin the work. I know that folks are talking about it in the UCASC and the curriculum discussion, but each of you see these resources here. Think about what does it mean. I told people last week, go back and watch when it gets posted, the lecture that was done last week about the ethics of social mobility. And it was, for me, an eye-opening moment in terms of understanding the perspective of our students and how it impacts how we conduct freshman orientation, transfer orientation. And so it's important that we begin to really understand these concepts and these principles and the history to then take the next step of figuring out, okay, how is that going to change my behavior in the classroom? How is that going to change my behavior in admissions? How is that going to change my behavior in the registrar's office? How is that going to change my behavior in public safety? All of these things, because it's all a collective that we need to figure out to figure out where our place is in this work to really move this work forward. So I want to thank Jose Luis and the folks who put together the position paper for really pushing us and challenging us to really do this difficult work. So thank you.
I'll be around for a few minutes if anyone has questions, and thank you again for coming.